was led into a simple, stark room that felt eerily like an interrogation room. The officer, though seemingly gentle, motioned for me to sit down, his gaze unnervingly focused. "According to your sister-in-law, Brooklyn," he began, "the kerosene you gave her was actually gasoline, which caused the kerosene stove to catch fire. Is that true?" I blinked, trying to process the accusation. "I didn't give Brooklyn any kerosene or gasoline," I said, my voice shakier than I wanted it to be. "I moved the kerosene I had because it was being stolen. I replaced it with gasoline in a locked storage shed." The officer didn't look convinced, and his intense gaze didn't waver. "So, you noticed kerosene was being used up, and you replaced it with gasoline? Why?" I felt my heart racing. "About 3 months ago, I noticed the kerosene was disappearing faster than usual, so I thought someone was stealing it. I moved the kerosene to a safer place and put gasoline in the storage box to keep it out of sight." The officer's expression didn't change. "You suspected Brooklyn, didn't you? Did you put gasoline there hoping something would go wrong if she took it?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. Was I being accused of setting this up intentionally? I opened my mouth to protest, but before I could say anything, the door to the room burst open. "Elena." It was Santiago, my husband, panting from running. He still had his suit on, likely coming straight from work. In his hand was our son Caden's game console. Of all things, Santiago handed the game console to the officer and said firmly, "Elena didn't do anything wrong. Look at this." The officer took the console, clearly confused. But Santiago's confidence made me feel a small flicker of hope. "My name is Elena. I'm 41 years old and live with my husband Santiago and our 9-year-old son Caden in an old house with a small garden that I adore. Our home is nestled in a peaceful, quiet area, and while there aren't many shops or conveniences nearby, the serenity of the place makes up for it. The people are kind, the surroundings beautiful." Santiago's family, his parents and his sister Brooklyn, live nearby. It's been a comfort, knowing family is close by, especially when Caden was little. When we all caught the flu a few years ago, my in-laws came to help, and I was grateful. Having reliable relatives nearby has always given me a sense of security. Brooklyn, however, was different. Unlike her soft-spoken brother, Brooklyn had a direct and outspoken personality. She frequently stopped by our home, and though her visits were friendly, there was always something slightly off about how she made herself at home. She'd let herself in, opening all the windows without asking. "You need more ventilation, Elena," she'd say. "This place will deteriorate if you don't let the air in." At first, I brushed it off. I had grown up in a house where we locked doors even for a short walk to the garden, so Brooklyn's casual attitude towards security seemed strange to me. One time, she caught me locking the door before we went out. "What are you doing?" she asked incredulously. "Locking the house," I replied, confused. "Why wouldn't I?" Brooklyn shook her head as if I'd said something absurd. "If a burglar sees the house locked, they'll think there's something valuable inside. It's better to leave it open, maybe even with some money visible. That way, if someone does break in, they'll just take the cash and go." I stood there, unsure of how to respond. Was this normal in this part of the country? I didn't want to seem rude, so I reluctantly followed her advice and didn't lock up that day, though it didn't sit right with me. As time went on, I began to feel more uneasy about Brooklyn's behavior. She'd take food from the fridge without asking, sometimes even the meals I had prepared for dinner. When I confronted Santiago about it, he shrugged it off. "She's family, and she's been helping with Caden. Let it go." But it wasn't just the food. Small things started to go missing. Snacks I'd bought for Caden, toiletries, even some of my cosmetics. I tried to ignore it, not wanting to create tension, but it was hard. Brooklyn treated our house like her own, and I didn't know how to address it without causing a fight. Then came the issue with the kerosene. One evening, as I was going over our household accounts, I noticed something odd. Our kerosene usage had spiked dramatically over the last few months. Even though we weren't using the heater as much due to the warmer weather, the amount we were buying kept increasing. I mentioned it to Santiago, who admitted he had noticed the same thing. "Maybe someone's stealing it," he suggested casually. The storage box outside isn't locked. We both agreed to move the kerosene to the shed, which had a lock, and replace the kerosene in the box with gasoline for the lawnmower. If someone's taking the kerosene, they won't be able to get to it now, Santiago said with a grin. I felt a sense of relief, thinking we had solved the problem. But I had no idea that this small change would lead to something much bigger. 2 days later, I came home to find a police officer standing outside our house with Caden. My heart stopped. What had Caden done? Was he in trouble? I rushed over, pale and anxious. Elena, the officer said, his tone serious, we need you to come with us to the station. For what? I asked, confused and terrified. Did something happen? No, it's not about your son. It's about you. I was taken to the police station in a patrol car, my mind racing the whole way. What on earth had I done? When we arrived, I was led into the interrogation room, where the officer calmly explained the situation. Brooklyn's house had caught fire that morning, and she was claiming that the kerosene she had taken from our house had actually been gasoline, causing the fire. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I didn't give her any kerosene, I said again, my voice firm. She must have taken it without asking. But the officer wasn't convinced. He pressed on, suggesting that I had intentionally placed the gasoline there, knowing Brooklyn would take it. That's when Santiago burst in with Caden's game console, a desperate look in his eyes. Look at this, he said, handing the console to the officer. It turns out, Caden had a habit of filming things with his game console, including Brooklyn sneaking into our yard to steal the kerosene. Santiago had found the footage by chance and brought it to the station. The video clearly showed Brooklyn taking the kerosene without permission, proving that she had been stealing it all along. The officer reviewed the footage, and it was enough to clear my name. Brooklyn, who had barged into the room earlier, was now silent, her face pale as the reality of the situation sank in. As the video played, showing Brooklyn sneaking into our yard, transferring kerosene into her own canister, I could feel the tension in the room shift. The officer's stern expression softened, and Brooklyn, who had stormed in with so much bravado, now stood frozen, her face drained of color. Is this true, Brooklyn? The officer asked, turning to her. For a moment, Brooklyn didn't speak. She looked like a child caught in a lie, eyes wide and darting from me to the officer to Santiago. Then, as if realizing she had no way out, she crossed her arms and scowled. So what if I took the kerosene? She muttered. We're family. It's not like I was stealing from a stranger. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything, Brooklyn was still trying to justify her actions. It doesn't matter if we're family, I said, my voice finally steadying. You took something without asking, and then you used gasoline, thinking it was kerosene. That's why the fire happened. Gasoline? Brooklyn spat the word like it was something foul. Who leaves gasoline where there should be kerosene? You knew I was taking it, didn't you? You set me up. I stared at her in disbelief. Set her up? How could she twist things like this? The officer cleared his throat, cutting through the heated exchange. The fact remains that you took something that didn't belong to you, he said to Brooklyn, and you failed to notice that it was gasoline which led to the fire. Brooklyn's arms dropped, and her shoulders sagged. For a moment, it seemed like she might try to argue further, but the weight of the evidence was too much. She slumped into a chair, shaking her head. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, she muttered, her voice barely audible. Santiago, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. His voice was low but firm. You didn't mean for it to happen, but it did. You almost burned down your house because of your carelessness, and instead of owning up to it, you tried to blame Elena. That's not okay. Brooklyn didn't look up. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, her face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and shame. The officer took a deep breath and closed his notebook. This seems like a family matter now. Brooklyn, I suggest you take responsibility for your actions, apologize to your sister-in-law, and deal with the consequences of the fire. As for Elena and Santiago, you're free to go. There's no need for further questioning. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly followed by an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. I hadn't realized how tense my body had been until the officer's words gave me permission to breathe again. Santiago placed a hand on my shoulder, his silent way of telling me it was over. As we stood to leave, Brooklyn remained in the chair, still not looking at us. Part of me wanted to say something, maybe offer her some comfort or tell her it was okay, but the hurt and anger inside me wouldn't allow it. Not yet. When we arrived home, the tension still lingered, but now it felt different, like a storm had passed, leaving only the debris behind. I sat down at the kitchen table, my hands trembling slightly as I poured myself a glass of water. Santiago sat across from me, his face tired but calm. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he said softly. "I had no idea Brooklyn was stealing from us. I should have paid more attention." I shook my head. "It's not your fault. I didn't see it either. I never thought she'd go this far." Santiago sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I knew Brooklyn had her issues. She's always been a bit reckless, but I never thought she'd do something like this." I nodded, taking a sip of water. "Do you think she'll ever admit she was wrong?" Santiago gave a bitter laugh. "Brooklyn? Probably not. But it doesn't matter. The important thing is that you're cleared. The police know you had nothing to do with it." As much as I wanted to believe that, I knew there was still a part of me that couldn't shake the way Brooklyn had tried to turn the blame on me. It hurt, more than I wanted to admit, that someone I had considered family could do something like that. Over the next few days, we didn't hear much from Brooklyn. Santiago's mother, however, called multiple times, apologizing profusely for Brooklyn's behavior. "I'm so sorry, Elena," she said one afternoon over the phone. "I had no idea Brooklyn was taking things from your house. If I had known, I would have stopped her." "I know you would have," I replied, trying to keep my voice even. I didn't want to take my frustration out on her. "But it's over now. We're just trying to move on." Santiago's mother sighed heavily on the other end of the line. "Brooklyn's a mess right now. She's been gambling a lot, and she's in a lot of debt. I don't know how to help her." The news hit me like a punch to the gut. Gambling? Debt? I had known Brooklyn was reckless, but I hadn't realized how deep her problems ran. Suddenly, her erratic behavior made more sense. Taking our kerosene, using our food and toiletries, even trying to pin the blame for the fire on me. She was desperate, and desperation made people do irrational things. "What's she going to do now?" I asked, unsure if I even wanted to know the answer. "She's trying to work things out," Santiago's mother replied, her voice weary. "But I think she's going to have to sell her house to cover the costs. I just hope this will be a wake-up call for her." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to feel sympathy for Brooklyn, but another part of me, the part that still felt betrayed, was struggling to let go of the anger. I thanked Santiago's mother for calling and hung up, feeling more conflicted than ever. Time passed, and life slowly returned to normal. Brooklyn stopped coming around, and while I knew she was still living nearby, our paths never crossed. Santiago and I focused on our family, on Caden, and on restoring a sense of peace in our home. One evening, a few months after the fire incident, Santiago and I were sitting in the garden, watching Caden play with the digital camera we had bought him. He had developed a love for photography, spending hours capturing images of flowers, trees, and sunsets. It was a relief to see him so engaged in something creative after the tension of the last few months. "Look, Mom," Caden called out, running over to show me a picture he had just taken of the sunset. "Isn't it cool?" I smiled, admiring the photo. "It's beautiful, Caden. You've got a real talent for this." Caden beamed with pride, his face lighting up. "Maybe I'll be a photographer when I grow up." Santiago chuckled, ruffling Caden's hair. "If that's what you want to do, we'll support you all the way." As I watched Caden run off to take more photos, I couldn't help but think about how close we had come to losing this piece. If things had gone differently, if the fire had spread, or if the blame had stuck, our lives could have been torn apart. But we had made it through, stronger than before. And while Brooklyn's actions had hurt me deeply, I knew that holding on to that hurt wouldn't serve me in the long run. She had made her choices, and she was paying the price for them. All I could do now was focus on my family, on our future, and on the life we were building together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the garden, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. The storm had passed, and we had come out on the other side, a little bruised but still standing. And that was enough. A few weeks after the confrontation with Brooklyn, life began to settle into a comfortable rhythm again. I found myself drawn more and more to our quiet garden, where Caden's laughter and Santiago's steady presence reminded me of the simple joys I had taken for granted. The kerosene incident felt like a distant memory, though the impact of what had happened still lingered in subtle ways. Santiago's relationship with his sister remained strained, to say the least. Brooklyn had been avoiding us, and Santiago, while still hurt, seemed to accept that distance. He didn't bring her up much, and I could tell he was trying to let go of his anger. But every now and then, in the quiet moments, I could see the sadness in his eyes. The pain of realizing that someone he had grown up with had betrayed our trust so deeply. One evening, we were sitting on the back porch, watching the last rays of the sun dip below the horizon. Caden was inside, glued to his new photography books, which he had been devouring since he declared he wanted to be a professional photographer. Santiago sat beside me, quiet, his hands resting on the armrests of the old wicker chair he loved. "You know," he said softly, breaking the silence, "I never imagined Brooklyn would do something like this." I looked at him, surprised that he was bringing it up after so long. "I don't think any of us did," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I grew up with her. She was wild, sure, but I always thought there was a line she wouldn't cross. This whole thing, stealing from us, blaming you, it's hard to wrap my head around." I reached out, placing my hand on top of his. "It's not your fault, Santiago. She made her choices. You can't blame yourself for that." He nodded, but didn't look entirely convinced. "I know, but I keep thinking, what if I'd noticed sooner? What if I'd stepped in? Maybe she wouldn't have gone so far." I squeezed his hand gently. "You did everything you could, and you stood up for me when it mattered most. That's what counts." Santiago looked at me, his eyes full of gratitude, and for a moment, the weight of everything seemed to lift. We sat there in the fading light, hand in hand, letting the silence say what words couldn't. A few days later, I received a phone call from Santiago's mother. Her voice, usually bright and cheery, sounded tired and strained. "Elena, I hope I'm not bothering you," she began, clearly hesitant. "Of course not," I replied, concern growing. "Is everything okay?" There was a pause before she answered. "It's about Brooklyn." My heart sank. I hadn't heard from or about Brooklyn since the incident, and part of me had hoped that meant she was staying out of trouble. But from the sound of Santiago's mother's voice, that wasn't the case. She's not doing well," she continued. "After the fire and everything that happened, she's been struggling. Financially, emotionally, it's all catching up with her. I don't know what to do. I didn't know what to say." Despite everything Brooklyn had done, I couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for her. It was clear that she was in over her head, but I also remembered the way she had tried to pin the blame on me, the way she had taken advantage of our trust. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said carefully. "But what can we do? I mean, Santiago and I can't just pretend like nothing happened." Santiago's mother sighed. I know. I'm not asking you to forgive her. She doesn't deserve that, not after everything. But she's family, and I can't just watch her fall apart like this." I closed my eyes, torn between wanting to help and wanting to protect myself and my family from being hurt again. "Has she reached out to you?" "Not really," she admitted. "She's too proud. But I've been keeping an eye on her. She's drowning in debt, and with her gambling problem, it's just getting worse. I don't know how much longer she can hold on." The thought of Brooklyn spiraling out of control made me uneasy. As much as I wanted to move on, the idea of leaving her to face this alone didn't sit right with me either. Maybe... I hesitated, unsure if I was making the right choice. Maybe we could help her, but from a distance. I'm not ready to let her back into our lives, but we can't ignore what's happening either. Santiago's mother sounded relieved. "That's all I'm asking, Elena. I just don't want her to feel completely abandoned." After the call ended, I sat on the couch, thinking about everything that had happened. Brooklyn had made terrible decisions, but she was still part of Santiago's family. Cutting her off entirely didn't seem right, but how could we help without getting hurt again? When Santiago came home from work that evening, I told him about the conversation with his mother. He listened quietly, his face a mixture of frustration and concern. "What do you think we should do?" he asked after I had finished. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I don't want to see her destroy herself. Maybe there's a way to help her without letting her take advantage of us again." Santiago leaned back in his chair, thinking. "She's in a bad place," he said slowly. "But if we step in, we have to set boundaries, clear ones. I can't let her drag us down with her." "I agree," I said, feeling the tension in my chest loosen slightly. "We can help her, but we have to protect ourselves first." Over the next few weeks, Santiago and I reached out to his mother to figure out the best way to help Brooklyn without getting too close. We agreed to help pay off some of her debt, but only on the condition that she sought professional help for her gambling addiction. It wasn't much, but it was something. Brooklyn, predictably, was resistant at first. She didn't want to admit she had a problem, and she didn't want to accept help if it came with strings attached. But as her financial situation worsened, she finally agreed to go to counseling. It was a small step, but it felt like progress. Santiago and I kept our distance, letting his mother handle most of the interactions with Brooklyn. It was better that way, safer for us emotionally. I didn't know if Brooklyn would ever truly change, but at least we were doing what we could without letting her back into our lives completely. One afternoon, as I was working in the garden, Caden came running out of the house, camera in hand. "Mom, look at this!" he shouted excitedly, holding up the camera for me to see. I smiled, brushing dirt from my hands as I took the camera. On the screen was a picture of our house, framed perfectly with the trees and flowers in the foreground. It was beautiful, and I couldn't believe how talented Caden had become. "This is amazing," I said, handing the camera back to him. "You're getting better every day." Caden beamed with pride. "Do you think I could be a photographer when I grow up?" "Absolutely," I replied. "You can be anything you want to be." As I watched Caden run off to take more photos, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in months. Our lives weren't perfect, and the situation with Brooklyn was far from resolved. But in that moment, everything felt right. Santiago came out to join me, leaning against the porch railing as he watched Caden dart around the yard. "He's really into that camera, huh?" Santiago said with a smile. "He loves it," I replied, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face. "And he's getting really good." Santiago looked at me, his expression softening. "We've been through a lot lately, haven't we?" I nodded. "Yeah, but we're stronger because of it." He reached for my hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "No matter what happens, we'll always get through it together." And in that moment, I knew he was right. No matter what challenges came our way, whether it was family drama, financial struggles, or anything else, we had each other. And that was enough. A few months had passed since we decided to help Brooklyn from a distance. Though the tension surrounding the fire and the kerosene theft had eased, life still felt a little unsteady. Brooklyn, after agreeing to seek help for her gambling problem, had started attending counseling, and Santiago's mother kept us updated on her progress. While there wasn't much interaction between us and Brooklyn, knowing that she was trying, however reluctantly, was a small relief. Santiago and I spent most of our days focused on Caden and our little family. Caden's obsession with photography had only grown, and Santiago and I encouraged it as much as we could. We even found a small photography class at the community center for kids his age, and Caden, ever the eager learner, was thrilled to start attending one weekend. While Santiago was working in the garage and Caden was out taking pictures around the neighborhood, I received an unexpected call. It was Santiago's mother, and this time her voice was strained with urgency. "Elena," she began, her words coming out in a rush. "I don't know what to do with Brooklyn anymore. I thought the counseling was helping, but she's started gambling again, and now she's asking for money. Again." I sighed, feeling the familiar tension rise in my chest. We had helped Brooklyn as much as we could, setting clear boundaries to protect ourselves, but now it seemed like she was slipping back into old habits. I had been afraid this would happen, but hearing it confirmed felt like a punch to the gut. "I'm so sorry," Santiago's mother continued, clearly distressed. "She's drowning in debt, and I don't have anything left to give her." I don't know if she's going to be able to pull herself out of this. My heart sank. I didn't want to get involved again, not after everything that had happened, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling of responsibility. Brooklyn was part of Santiago's family, and while she had caused us a great deal of pain, it was hard to turn our backs on her completely. "I'll talk to Santiago," I said softly, "but I don't know how much more we can do. We've already helped as much as we could, and Brooklyn needs to take responsibility for herself." "I understand," Santiago's mother replied, her voice heavy with guilt. "I just don't want to see her lose everything. She's already lost so much." After the call, I sat on the porch, my thoughts swirling. I knew I had to talk to Santiago about what his mother had said, but I dreaded the conversation. Brooklyn's choices had put an enormous strain on our family, and I didn't want to open that wound again later that evening. As we sat together on the couch, I broached the subject gently. "Your mom called today," I said, glancing at Santiago. "It's about Brooklyn." Santiago sighed, leaning back against the cushions. "What now?" "She's started gambling again," I said quietly. "And she's asking your mom for money. Apparently, she's in even more debt than before." Santiago closed his eyes, rubbing his temples. "I should have known. She couldn't stay out of trouble for long." I nodded, understanding his frustration. "Your mom is really worried. She doesn't know what to do." For a long time, Santiago didn't say anything. I could see the conflict on his face, the push and pull between wanting to help and knowing that Brooklyn needed to face the consequences of her actions. Finally, he spoke. "I don't think we can help her anymore, Elena," he said, his voice tired but firm. "We've done everything we could, and she's still making the same mistakes. I love my sister, but she's going to have to figure this out on her own." I reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "I agree. We can't keep bailing her out. It's not fair to us, and it's not fair to Caden. We need to focus on our family now." Santiago nodded, though I could see the sadness in his eyes. "I just wish things had turned out differently. I wanted to believe she could change." "Me too," I said softly. "But we can't control what she does. We've done our part." The next few weeks passed quietly, and though we still heard updates about Brooklyn from Santiago's mother, it seemed like she was continuing down a difficult path. Santiago and I distanced ourselves from the situation as much as possible, focusing instead on Caden and our own lives. One Saturday morning, while we were all sitting in the garden enjoying breakfast, Santiago's phone buzzed with a message. He glanced at the screen, his expression shifting from relaxed to concerned. "What is it?" I asked, noticing the change in his demeanor. "It's from Mom," he replied, his brow furrowed. Well, she's leaving town. She says she needs to get away for a while." I raised an eyebrow, surprised by the news. "Leaving town? Where's she going?" Santiago shrugged. "She didn't say, just that she's packing up and going somewhere far away. I guess she's running from her problems again." I felt a mixture of relief and concern. Part of me was glad that Brooklyn was putting some distance between us, but another part of me worried about what would happen to her out there, all alone and still struggling with her demons. "Do you think she'll be okay?" I asked, not sure if I wanted to hear the answer. Santiago sighed, setting his phone down. "I don't know. Maybe this is what she needs, a fresh start somewhere else. But I can't keep worrying about her, Elena. We've done all we can." He was right, of course. We had tried to help, and Brooklyn had made her choices. All we could do now was hope that she would find her way on her own. As the days passed, we heard less and less about Brooklyn. It was as if she had vanished from our lives completely. Santiago's mother, though worried, seemed to accept that there was nothing more she could do. And while I still thought about Brooklyn from time to time, I found myself focusing more and more on the life we were building, on Caden, on our home, and on the future. One afternoon, as I was tidying up the living room, Caden came running in, his face lit up with excitement. "Mom, guess what?" he shouted, waving a piece of paper in his hand. "What is it, sweetie?" I asked, smiling at his enthusiasm. "I got accepted into the photography competition," he exclaimed, thrusting the paper toward me. I took the paper from him, reading over the details. It was a local photography contest for kids, and Caden's entry had been chosen to be displayed at an upcoming exhibition. "That's amazing, Caden," I said, pulling him into a hug. "I'm so proud of you," Caden beamed, his face glowing with pride. "I worked really hard on my pictures. I can't wait to show everyone." Later that evening, Santiago and I sat together, talking about how much Caden had grown over the past year. Despite everything that had happened with Brooklyn, our family had come through stronger and more united than ever. "You know," Santiago said, his voice thoughtful, "I never imagined that after all the drama, we'd end up here, sitting in our garden, watching Caden thrive. It feels like a miracle." I smiled, leaning into him. "It does, doesn't it? I think we've earned this peace." Santiago nodded, his arm wrapping around my shoulders. "We've been through a lot, but we made it through. Together." And as we sat there, watching Caden take photos in the fading light of the day, I realized that Santiago was right. Our lives weren't perfect, and there would always be challenges, but we had built something strong, something that couldn't be torn apart by the chaos of the past. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over our little garden, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the life we had created. The future was uncertain, and we couldn't control what lay ahead, but for now we were happy. We were together, and that was enough.